The snow fell in thick curtains across the Estonian coast on the morning of November 30th, 1700, obscuring the besieging army that sprawled across the frozen marshlands surrounding the fortress of Narva. Within that vast encampment, numbering perhaps 40,000 men, the chronicle vary. But all agree the host was enormous. Tsar Peter I of Russia commanded the greatest military force his realm had leave, are assembled for foreign conquest. Artillery parks stretch for hundreds of yards, their bronze barrels gleaming dully in the grey light. Infantry regiments recruited from the vastness of Muscovy stood in their camps, huddled against the Baltic cold that penetrated even their thick coats. Cavalry units, Cossacks and provincial levies waited in reserve. Supply wagons by the thousand had been dragged across the muddy tracks from Novgorod and Pskov, carrying powder and shot, biscuit and salt pork. All the materiel required to reduce a fortified city through siege and bombardment. Peter himself moved among his troops with the manic energy that characterized all his endeavors, tall and imposing despite his ungainly gait, inspecting positions, questioning officers, demonstrating personally how artillery should be sighted, for he had studied gunnery in Amsterdam, and prided himself on technical knowledge that his boyar generals lacked. The young Tsar, not yet 30 years old, had spent his minority absorbing Western military science while his regents ruled in Moscow. And he had come to Narva determined to prove that Russia could wage war in the modern European manner, that the days when Muscovite armies relied on mass and ferocity rather than discipline and tactics were ending. The capture of Narva would open the Baltic to Russian power, provide the port access that Peter desperately needed for his vision of a westernized, maritime Russia, and demonstrate to the European powers that a new force had emerged in the north. Yet for all the imposing scale of Peter's host and the modernity of its organization, regiments structured on Western models, officers trained in European tactics, artillery cast in new foundries built specifically for this campaign, there remained something fundamentally unfinished about this army. Many of the soldiers were new recruits, peasants dragged from their villages by the levy system, given muskets and rudimentary training, and marched to war. The officers, though some had studied abroad or hired Western tutors, lacked combat experience. The logistics, though improved from earlier Muscovite campaigns, remained chaotic by the standards of Western armies. Supplies arrived irregularly, units became separated from their baggage trains, and the Russian commissariat struggled with the basic arithmetic of feeding 40,000 men in enemy territory as went approached. The siege itself had stalled. Russian artillery had bombarded Narva's walls for weeks, without achieving a practicable breach, and the garrison, though outnumbered and outgunned, showed no inclination to surrender. Inside Narva's walls, the situation was indeed desperate, but not yet hopeless. The Swedish garrison numbered perhaps 2,000 men under the command of Colonel Henning Rudolf Horn, a capable officer who understood that his task was not to hold indefinitely but to buy time. Every day that Narva resisted was another day for Swedish relief forces to assemble, another day of supplies consumed from the Russian siege train, another day closer to the Baltic winter that would make campaigning impossible. Horn had strengthened the medieval fortifications as best he could, positioning his limited artillery to cover the approaches, rationing supplies to stretch them through a long siege, and maintaining discipline among his garrison despite the constant bombardment and the knowledge that they were vastly outnumbered. The fortress itself, perched on the western bank of the Narva River where it emptied into the Gulf of Finland, commanded the strategic approaches between Swedish Estonia and Russian territory. Its walls, though not built to the latest geometrical standards of Vauban, were substantial enough to require serious siege operations to reduce. The river at its back provided both protection and a potential escape route. though the current ran swift and cold in late November, promising death to any who attempted to swim it in full armor. Horn's men watched from their ramparts as the Russian positions expanded, as new artillery batteries were emplaced, as the siege trenches crept closer through the frozen ground. And they waited for the relief that Horn assured them would come. That relief was indeed coming, though its scale would have astonished even the optimistic Colonel Horn. Charles XII, King of Sweden, had landed at Pernau with an army that numbered, according to the most reliable accounts, approximately 8,000 men. This force represented the core of the Swedish military system regiments recruited from Sweden's provinces under the Indelning system that provided each soldier with a small farm, whose revenue supported him, creating a semi-professional standing army without the crushing tax burden that maintained armies imposed on other European states. These were veteran units, led by officers of the Swedish nobility who had been raised from childhood to view military command as both duty and privilege, stiffened by NCOs who treated soldiering as a craft to be perfected through drill and discipline. Yet 8,000 men, no matter how well trained, seemed an impossibly small force to relieve a fortress besieged by 40,000. The disparity in numbers violated every principle of military science. Conventional wisdom held that a relieving force needed to outnumber the besiegers to have any hope of success, or at the very least to achieve rough parity. Charles XII commanded a force 1/5 the size of the Russian army, advancing to attack an entrenched enemy in prepared positions with artillery support. It was, by any rational calculation, a suicide mission. A gesture of defiance that might solve Swedish honor, but would accomplish nothing except the destruction of Sweden's field army and the probable capture or death of the king himself. Charles XII, however, had never been constrained by rational calculation. 18 years old in 1700, he had inherited the Swedish throne 3 years earlier upon the death of his father, Charles XI, who had rebuilt Swedish finances and military power after the disasters of the mid-17th century. The young king had been raised in the martial tradition of the Vasa dynasty, educated in military history and tactics, trained in horsemanship and swordsmanship, imbued with an almost religious sense of divine mission. He viewed warfare not as a necessary evil, but as the ultimate test of royal virtue, and he approached combat with a recklessness that contemporaries attributed variously to courage, madness, or divine inspiration. The strategic situation that had brought Charles to Narva was itself the product of his seeming vulnerability. In 1700, Sweden's Baltic Empire, stretching from Finland through Estonia and Livonia, encompassing parts of northern Germany, dominating the trade routes of the Baltic Sea, appeared overextended and ripe for a partition. Sweden's population numbered perhaps 2 million souls, dwarfed by the kingdoms and empires that surrounded it. When Charles XI died and his teenage son inherited the throne, Sweden's enemies saw opportunity. Denmark, Saxony-Poland, and Russia had formed a coalition, coordinating their attacks to strike simultaneously at different parts of Sweden's empire. Calculating that the young king would be unable to respond effectively to threats on multiple fronts, they had miscalculated catastrophically regarding Charles's character. Upon learning of the coalition's formation, Charles had responded not with diplomatic maneuvers or cautious defensive preparations, but with immediate offensive action. He had transported a Swedish army across the Sound in a brilliant amphibious operation, landed outside Copenhagen, and forced Denmark out of the war within weeks through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic negotiation. That threat eliminated, he had turned his attention to the eastern Baltic, where Augustus II of Saxony-Poland was besieging Riga, while Peter's Russians invested Narva. Riga could hold; its fortifications were strong, its garrison substantial. Narva was the more vulnerable target, and Charles determined to relieve it personally. The march from Pernau to Narva tested the Swedish army severely. The roads, such as they were, had dissolved into mud and ice. Supply wagons bogged down or broke axles. The countryside, already poor, had been stripped by the Russian foraging parties. Charles drove his men forward regardless, covering in days distances that should have required weeks, pushing through weather that made campaigning seem impossible. The soldiers, though exhausted, maintained their discipline and cohesion, sustained by confidence in their king and by the regimental pride that was the Swedish army's greatest intangible asset. As the Swedish force approached Narva in late November, Charles conducted personal reconnaissance of the Russian positions, riding to within musket shot of their lines, studying their dispositions with the eye of a commander who had absorbed every lesson of military history. What he observed should have confirmed the impossibility of his task. The Russians had fortified their siege lines with earthworks and palisades, creating a continuous defensive perimeter several miles in length. Their artillery was positioned to cover all approaches. Their vast numbers meant they could defend their entire perimeter simultaneously while maintaining reserves to counterattack any breakthrough. Moreover, they held the advantage of prepared positions the Swedes would have to attack across open ground, uphill in places, against an entrenched enemy. Yet Charles also observed weaknesses that a less aggressive commander might not have recognized as exploitable. The Russian positions, though extensive, were perhaps overextended given their depth. The siege lines formed a thin crust rather than a defense in depth. The terrain, marshy and cut by streams, channeled movement and limited the Russians' ability to shift reserves quickly. Most critically, Charles observed signs of poor coordination between different sectors of the Russian line, suggesting that the boyar generals commanding various divisions might not cooperate effectively in a crisis. Peter himself was not present. He had departed Narva days earlier to coordinate operations elsewhere, leaving command to an Austrian mercenary general, Charles Eugene de Croix, who was competent but unfamiliar to the Russian troops and lacking the authority that personal royal presence provided. Charles made his decision with characteristic swiftness. He would attack the following day, November 30th, concentrating his entire force against a single point of the Russian line and betting everything on achieving a breakthrough before the Russians could redeploy their superior numbers. It was a strategy born of desperation and audacity in equal measure, relying on Swedish discipline and shock action to overcome impossible odds. He gathered his senior officers' men like Carl Gustaf Renskild, the gifted cavalry commander, and Otto Velink, who would lead the infantry assault, and explained his plan. There were no voices raised in protest, though every man present understood the magnitude of the gamble. Swedish military culture, shaped by decades of warfare across Europe during the 30 Years' War and the conflicts that followed, had created an officer corps that accepted risk as inherent to their profession and trusted their king's judgment even when it seemed to violate military reason. The morning of November 30th dawned grey and bitterly cold, with snow beginning to fall by mid-morning. The Swedish army formed up in battle order several miles from the Russian positions, organized into two lines: infantry in the center, cavalry on the wings, light artillery interspersed among the infantry battalions. They numbered, at most, 8,000 men, facing an enemy 5 times their strength. Charles, mounted on his war horse and wearing the blue and yellow of the Swedish Royal Guard, rode along the lines, speaking briefly to each regiment. His words lost to history, but their effect preserved in the chronicles that describe soldiers, cheering despite their exhaustion and the coming battle. The advance began at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Swedish infantry moving forward in their distinctive tight formations, drums beating the cadence. Regimental colors unfurled despite the wind. The cavalry walked their horses, preserving their mounts' strength for the charge that would come. Charles positioned himself with the right-wing cavalry under Renskild, intending to lead the decisive attack personally, a decision that reflected both his courage and his understanding that Swedish soldiers fought best when their king shared their danger. As the Swedish army approached to within artillery range, the Russian guns opened fire, their shot plunging into the advancing formations. Men fell, torn apart by iron shot or dismembered by chain shot designed to scythe through ranks of infantry. The Swedish formations closed up round the casualties and continued advancing, maintaining their alignment with a precision that spoke to years of drill and iron discipline. The Russian gunners, many of them inexperienced, fired too high or misjudged the range, and much of their fire proved ineffective. But enough found its mark to leave a trail of broken bodies across the snow behind the Swedish advance. At perhaps 300 yards, the Russian infantry opened fire, thousands of muskets discharging in ragged volleys that created a wall of smoke and lead. The Swedish troops, still advancing, took casualties but did not return fire. Charles had ordered them to hold their fire until they reached close range, trusting in speed and shock over firepower. This was the Swedish way of war, perfected over decades of European campaigning. Advance rapidly under fire, absorb the enemy's first volleys, and then strike with such violence and determination that the enemy's line shattered before they could reload. At approximately 100 yards, the Swedish line broke into a run. Not a wild charge, but a controlled advance at the double quick. The infantry still maintaining formation despite the increased pace. The Russian fire intensified, volleys crashing out from the earthworks. But now the Swedes were moving targets, and much of the fire went wide. At 50 yards, the Swedish infantry finally halted, dressed their ranks with parade ground precision even as Russian bullets hummed round them, delivered their own volley a single devastating discharge of thousands of muskets fired simultaneously at point-blank range. The effect on the Russian line was catastrophic. Men fell in heaps, the packed ranks offering no shelter from the Swedish musketry. Before the Russians could recover, the Swedish infantry charged forward with fixed bayonets, and the infantry melee began. Swedish infantry tactics emphasized the decisive shock of cold steel over prolonged firefights. The soldiers were trained to use their bayonets aggressively, to close with the enemy rather than stand at musket range trading volleys. Against an enemy of equal discipline and determination, such tactics were costly. But against the Russian conscripts, many of whom were recent recruits with minimal training, the Swedish assault proved overwhelming. The Russian line buckled, then broke, soldiers throwing down their muskets and fleeing back toward their camps. On the wings, Renskild led the Swedish cavalry in a coordinated charge against the Russian horse. The Swedish cavalry, like their infantry, relied on shock tactics. The charge delivered at full gallop with sabers drawn, intended to break enemy formations through sheer momentum and violence. The Russian cavalry, numerically superior but dispersed across a wide front and poorly coordinated, could not concentrate effectively to meet the Swedish attack. Individual units found themselves facing Swedish squadrons that struck with devastating force, breaking through and then wheeling to attack the flanks of adjacent Russian units. Within minutes, the Russian cavalry on both wings was in full retreat, streaming back across the frozen marshland in disorder. The breakthrough achieved, Charles faced the critical decision: pursue the fleeing Russians or consolidate and prepare for the inevitable counterattack. He chose to press forward, driving the Swedish assault deeper into the Russian positions, fragmenting the siege lines further and creating chaos in the Russian rear areas. The blizzard that had been building throughout the afternoon now struck with full force, reducing visibility to a few yards and turning the battlefield into a white hell where friend and foe became end. Extinguishable. This weather, which should have halted operations entirely, instead worked to Swedish advantage. It prevented the Russian commanders from seeing the true scale of the Swedish force and organizing enough active defense. General de Croix, attempting to rally the Russian army and organize a defense using the troops who had not yet engaged, found his orders ignored or misunderstood in the chaos. The language barrier: he spoke German and French, but little Russian complicated communication with his subordinate commanders. The boyar generals, resentful of serving under a foreign mercenary and uncertain of their authority in Peter's absence, failed to cooperate effectively. Some units stood firm, maintaining their positions and exchanging fire with Swedish attackers they could barely see through the snow. Others broke and fled at the first Swedish assault. The Russian artillery, which should have been a decisive advantage, was largely neutralized. The gunners could not see targets in the blizzard, and many had abandoned their pieces when Swedish infantry appeared suddenly out of the snow. By late afternoon, the Russian siege lines had fragmented into isolated pockets of resistance surrounded by Swedish troops. Some Russian units, trapped with their backs to the Narva River, attempted to surrender but found communication impossible in the chaos and were cut down or driven into the icy water where they drowned. In their hundreds, other formations held together, forming defensive squares and maintaining discipline even as the battle dissolved round them. The Russian Guards regiments, Peter's showpiece units trained and equipped to Western standards, fought with determination and professionalism, extracting a heavy toll from Swedish units that engaged them. As darkness fell, the battle degenerated into a confused series of separate engagements across the frozen landscape. Swedish units, pursuing fleeing Russians, became disoriented in the blizzard and dark. Russian formations, attempting to withdraw across the bridges over the Narva River, found the spans clogged with fugitives and wagons, creating bottlenecks where Swedish cavalry caught them and inflicted further casualties. The bridges themselves, overloaded and damaged, began to collapse, sending men and horses plunging into the black water. Charles, throughout this phase, remained at the front, leading charges personally, rallying Swedish units that had become separated, demonstrating the physical courage that would become his defining characteristic. He seemed to bear a charmed life. Accounts describe bullets striking near him, his horse being wounded under him, subordinates falling round him while he emerged unscathed. Whether through divine providence, extraordinary luck, or the protection afforded by being constantly in motion, the young king survived the battle without serious injury, though his uniform was reportedly torn by musket balls and his hat struck by shot. By the time full darkness ended the fighting, the Russian army had ceased to exist as a coherent force. Thousands lay dead on the field, thousands more had drowned attempting to cross the river, and the survivors were scattered across the Estonian countryside in small groups, attempting to make their way back to Russian territory. The Swedish army, exhausted but victorious, held the Russian camps with all their artillery, supplies and baggage. General de Croix, attempting to organize a defense on the eastern bank of the river, found himself with perhaps 10,000 disorganized and demoralized soldiers from the original 40,000. He requested terms. Charles, demonstrating both the magnanimity and the calculated ruthlessness that characterized his kinship, offered generous surrender terms. The Russian soldiers could return home. Their officers could retain their swords. The Guards' regiments could march out with colors flying in recognition of their brave resistance. In exchange, the Russians would abandon all their artillery, all their supplies, all their wounded, and sign a formal capitulation acknowledging Swedish victory. De Croix, recognizing he had no realistic alternative, accepted. Over the following days, the remnants of Peter's great army marched eastward in shame, leaving behind 200 artillery pieces, thousands of muskets, vast quantities of powder and shot. Their entire supply train, and between 10 and 15,000 of their comrades dead or captured. The tactical and strategic implications of Narva were immediate and profound. Sweden had demonstrated, in the most dramatic fashion possible, that numerical superiority meant nothing without discipline, leadership, and tactical competence. Charles XII had established himself as not merely a boy king to be manipulated by regents and councillors, but as a military commander of genius, capable of victories that seemed to violate the laws of warfare. The myth of Russian military power, carefully cultivated by Peter through his reforms and his new model army, had been exploded that Sir's 40,000 men had been routed by a force 1/5 their size. For Peter himself, absent from the battlefield but fully informed of the disaster within days, Narva represented a profound humiliation and a valuable lesson. His response revealed the qualities that would eventually make him a successful military reformer. Rather than blaming his generals or denying the scale of the defeat, he acknowledged that Russia's military system required fundamental reconstruction. He intensified his efforts to westernize the Russian army, hiring more foreign officers, establishing military schools, building new foundries to cast artillery to replace what had been lost at Narva, and creating recruiting and training systems that would produce soldiers capable of fighting European-style warfare effectively. Narva taught Peter that importing Western military forms was insufficient. Russia needed to develop the institutional infrastructure and tactical culture that made Western armies effective. For Sweden, Narva brought a false dawn of invincibility that would have tragic consequences. Charles, convinced that Russian power was a hollow shell and that his destiny was to punish the coalition that had attacked Sweden, would spend the next years campaigning across Poland and Saxony, winning battle after battle but failing to achieve decisive strategic results. His refusal to make peace when he held advantage, his insistence on pursuing total victory, and his eventual decision to invade Russia itself in 1708 would lead to disaster at Poltava in 1709, where Peter's reformed Russian army would decisively defeat the Swedes and reverse the verdict of Narva. But in December 1700, as Charles returned to Stockholm in triumph with captured Russian banners and artillery, such disasters seemed impossibly distant. The battle itself entered military legend as an example of how superior tactics, discipline, and leadership could overcome impossible numerical odds. Military theorists would study Narva for generations, extracting lessons about the importance of aggression, the value of close-order tactics, the decisive effect of shock action, the advantages of offensive over defensive warfare. Some of these lessons were valid, others dangerously misleading, but all contributed to a military culture that emphasized attack and maneuver over firepower and attrition. Yet Narva also demonstrated the limitations of tactical brilliance unsupported by strategic wisdom. Charles had won an impossible victory, but he had not ended the war. Russia remained a vast empire with enormous resources and a ruler determined to learn from defeat. The destruction of one Russian army would prove merely a temporary setback in Peter's grand design. Within a decade, Russia would field armies larger and more effective than the force destroyed at Narva, and those armies would eventually conquer the Baltic provinces that Sweden had spent a century acquiring. For the soldiers who fought at Narva, both Swedish and Russian, the battle represented different things. For the Swedes, it was validation of their martial culture, confirmation that Swedish infantry and Swedish kings were the finest in Europe, a victory to be celebrated in song and story. For the Russian survivors, it was a traumatic introduction to modern warfare, a revelation of how far Russian military practice lagged behind European standards, and a motivation to ensure such humiliation would never be repeated. Many of the Russian soldiers who fled across the ice at Narva would serve in the armies that defeated Sweden at Poltava, having learned hard lessons about the requirements of victory. The physical battlefield, that stretch of marshy ground and frozen streams outside Narva's walls, would see Russian armies return within a few years, this time successfully. Peter would eventually capture Narva in 1704, incorporating it into his new Russian Empire and using its port as one of the foundations for his naval ambitions in the Baltic. The fortress that Charles had relieved so dramatically would become Russian territory, as would all of Estonia and Livonia. Sweden's Baltic Empire dissolving under pressure from reformed Russian military power. But on that snowy afternoon in November 1700, as the teenage Swedish king led his 8,000 men against 40,000 Russians and emerged victorious, such future disasters seemed impossible. Charles XII had achieved the impossible, had demonstrated that courage and skill could triumph over overwhelming odds, had proven that one man's will and vision could shape the course of nations. He had not yielded when every rational calculation suggested surrender or retreat, and his refusal to yield had been vindicated by complete victory. The king who would not yield had won his impossible victory, had saved Narva and shattered the Russian army, had established himself as one of the great captains of European history. That the same stubbornness, the same refusal to accept limitations or compromise, would eventually destroy him and Sweden's great power status was not yet apparent. At Narva in 1700, Charles XII seemed touched by destiny, a warrior king from the heroic age reborn in the modern world. And his soldiers followed him with absolute confidence that no enemy could stand before Swedish arms when Charles led them. The snow that had covered the battlefield during the fighting continued to fall through the night, gradually concealing the corpses and the debris of combat, creating a white shroud over the Russian dead and the abandoned Russian artillery. By morning, the field would be transformed, peaceful and clean under its blanket of snow, giving no hint of the violence that had occurred there. But beneath that deceiving surface lay the truth of Narva, that warfare in the Age of Reason remained as brutal and chaotic as ever. That victory came to those willing to risk everything on a single desperate gamble. And that the king who would not yield had demonstrated that sometimes, against all probability and military science, audacity could triumph over prudence and courage could overcome impossible odds.